the early 20th century. The sea no longer belonged to the elements. It had become the arena for a new, silent war. On the surface, the wind howled, turbines roared, cannons thundered. But beneath the waves, there was only cold, darkness, and invisible movement. Where once fish and currents ruled, now lurked machines made by man. After World War I, Great Britain came to a terrifying realization. It could lose its empire not to an army, but to a handful of metal monsters roaming the ocean. Germany had proven this with its submarines, the U-boats, ghosts of the sea, capable of striking suddenly and vanishing into the abyss. Over the course of the war, they sank more than 5,000 ships. Every British sailor knew death might not come from a cannon, nor from the sky, but from the depths. But the most terrifying thing was not knowing where the enemy was. Sailors said a submarine was like a shark, one you couldn't see, but could hear in nightmares. Fleet commanders sat over maps of the Atlantic, knowing they had no defense. They could see for dozens of kilometers ahead, but not even a meter below the surface. The battle against an invisible enemy required a new kind of weapon, not one of iron and noise, but of sensitivity and intelligence. They had to learn to listen to the ocean. In those years, scientists and sailors rarely worked together. But now, under the pressure of threat, admirals began seeking not heroes, but thinkers. And so, in small offices at the Admiralty, physicists, engineers, acousticians, and naval officers gathered. Among them was Robert Boyle, a young engineer whose experiments with underwater waves were considered nearly insane. He claimed that one could see a submarine through sound. If light reflects off an object, why can't sound? He said, sketching strange diagrams on the chalkboard. Thus was born an idea that would later change the course of war: underwater sound location. At the time, it wasn't yet called sonar. Even the word ASDIC sounded like a code. It concealed the official name, Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. But to most sailors, it was simply that strange device that listens to the sea. The idea was beautiful in its simplicity. A ship sends out a sound pulse, a ping, which reflects off a submarine and returns. By measuring the time of the echo, one could determine the distance to the target. In theory, brilliant. In practice, nearly impossible. The ocean turned out to be not just a void, but a chaos of sounds. The noise of waves, the rumble of engines, the clicking of shrimp, the songs of whales. All of it interfered with hearing what truly mattered. The first devices registered echoes, but no one knew what they meant. It could be a submarine or just a school of cod. Nevertheless, the work began. In 1917, off the southern coast of England near Portsmouth, a group of engineers lowered the first experimental device into the sea. At first, silence. Then, a faint, barely audible echo. "There's a reflection!" shouted one of the technicians. From that cry, a new era of naval reconnaissance began. At the time, no one yet knew that this quiet ping, barely distinguishable in headphones, would one day become the sound that made German submariners' hearts freeze. And that humanity had, for the first time, heard the whisper of the deep, the voice of the ocean, which for centuries had remained silent. The first experiments with underwater hearing seemed more like magic than science. In dark hangars in southern England, engineers hauled cables, copper cylinders, and amplifiers that looked like tube radios. Cold cups of tea sat on the tables, while maps of ocean depths and equations resembling ciphers covered the walls. It all looked chaotic, but there was a sense in the air. Something was happening here that would change the course of the war. The main driving force was Robert Boyle, a physicist, not to be confused with the 17th century philosopher. This Boyle didn't write treatises on the nature of matter. He loved the sea and sound. While other engineers measured artillery range, he stood at the pier with a microphone, listening to how waves reflected the noise of a propeller. He noticed a simple thing. Sound travels faster and farther in water than in air. If one could hear a ship's propeller, then one could hear a submarine, even if it was dozens of meters below the surface. Thus began the first real experiments. Boyle, together with his colleague, engineer Albert Taylor, assembled an experimental device, a metal cylinder with a microphone inside and a sound transmitter. They called it simply echo detector. Taylor, a practical man, joked, "If this works, I'll stop hearing my wife at dinner." "If it works," Boyle replied, "you'll save the British Empire." The first field tests were a trial not only for the equipment, but for the people involved. Sailors assigned to assist the engineers were skeptical of the project. "Here come the professors again with their jars and wires," they grumbled as they lowered the heavy device into the cold water. But one day, something happened that changed the minds of even the most cynical officers. During a test off the coast of Portsmouth, the device suddenly gave a clear signal. The echo returned after a few seconds. There was nothing on the surface, only calm sea. Later, checks confirmed. A German submarine had indeed passed through that area, returning to base. "We heard it," Boyle said quietly. "We really heard it." Thus was born the first underwater acoustic detection system. And although it was still bulky, unreliable, and required silence aboard the ship, it was a step into a new era. The invention received a code name, ASDIC, short for Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. Even the name carried a sense of secrecy, as if the idea itself wanted to remain in the shadows. Gradually, Britain's best minds joined the project. Physicists from Oxford, engineers from the Royal Institution, even musicians with perfect pitch. Yes, musicians. They could distinguish the slightest frequency shifts and tell the difference between a false echo and a real signal. One of them, a young cellist, was nicknamed the Ears of the Fleet by the sailors. He could hear, through headphones, how a metal hull floated between two impulses. The work continued day and night. The ocean roared, devices broke down, and funding was scarce. The Admiralty was in no hurry to invest in what seemed like a scientist's toy. "We need guns, not sounds," officials said. But the scientists persisted, believing that one day the Navy would understand their importance. Boyle wrote in his diary, "We are creating eyes for the darkness, but for now, no one believes that darkness can be seen." And soon, the darkness answered. During another round of testing, one of the convoys reported being attacked by a submarine. Using the ASDIC prototype, the escort ship detected an underwater reflection and determined the enemy's direction. Minutes later, depth charges rained down precisely on the coordinates. For the first time in history, a submarine was destroyed using sound. It was a moment when the entire fleet fell silent. No one called ASDIC a toy anymore. Now it was a weapon of the future, capable of seeing into the abyss. The technology still needed refinement, but the most important thing had already happened. For the first time, Britain stopped fearing the ocean. There was a new belief. that man and sea could be reconciled, if only we learned to listen to it, rather than trying to conquer it. After the first successful trials, the scientists felt like pioneers, like Columbuses of sound. But what lay ahead was not a voyage to a new world, but an endless struggle with noise, water, and bureaucracy. The sea did not like being interfered with. Every experiment became a mixture of physics, luck, and prayer. At dawn, small ships loaded with equipment would depart from Portsmouth. The wind drove salty mist across the decks. The instruments trembled, and the engineers huddled under tarps, trying to shield fragile vacuum tubes from moisture. "These devices sink faster than they find submarines," joked the sailors. But it was in these conditions that something was born, something that would later save thousands of lives. The main problem was noise. The ocean roared, sang, whispered, but rarely stayed silent. Every bubble of air, every propeller thrust, every wave crash created interference. The instruments picked up so many signals that even experienced operators became confused. At times, it seemed the ocean itself was mocking them, imitating the sounds of submarines. One acoustician wrote in his log, "We chased a target for 40 minutes. Turned out, it was a whale. He was listening to us." Thus, a new rule appeared in the lab. Before dropping depth charges, make sure it's not a whale. But with each passing week, the engineers grew more skilled. They discovered that noise could be filtered by adjusting the ping frequency. They invented new microphones, hydrophones, with special membranes capable of detecting vibrations even through thick layers of water. Some engineers began using their own ears as instruments. They would close their eyes, listen to recordings, and say, "That's not a submarine, that's a current." "But that's metal. Hear it? The sound isn't soft, it rings." These people could distinguish the type of hull, depth, even the angle of movement, all by sound. They became the new navigators of a world where eyes were useless. Meanwhile, the Navy began to realize that behind these professors was a real weapon. The Admiralty allocated funding, and on the coast of Scotland, an Aztec testing base was established. There, engineers, officers, and sailors learned together how to hear underwater. They recorded the sounds of torpedoes, propellers, ship anchors. Each sound became part of a library, a kind of underwater dictionary. Thus emerged the first catalogue of acoustic signatures, the ancestor of modern sonar databases. Not everything went smoothly. Sometimes the equipment failed. Once, a device detected a hostile submarine in the Thames estuary. Panic broke out, alarms were raised, and an hour later, it was discovered that the signal came from a sunken fishing boat. The report dryly stated, "Object, wooden hull, likely 18th century." The engineers laughed, but the sailors remembered it for years. Our first enemy turned out to be a fisherman. Yet every such case made the system more accurate. The scientists learned from the ocean itself, observing how sound behaved at depth, how currents and temperature distorted waves. Gradually, Aztec became not just a device, but a language for communicating with the sea. In those years, as storm clouds gathered over Europe once again, the British worked tirelessly. They knew, if submarines returned to the ocean, they would have to be ready. The sea does not forgive a second chance. Boyle wrote in his diary, "We hear what others do not yet know how to listen for. When the storm breaks, we must be the ones who hear it first." By 1938, Aztec was no longer an experiment. It was a system installed on most Royal Navy destroyers. It looked modest, a panel with knobs, a dial, and headphones. But behind that simplicity lay years of labor, hundreds of failures, and thousands of listened pings. The sailors stopped laughing. Now, when an echo signal sounded in the headphones, everyone on deck froze. It could be a whale, or it could be the enemy. And somewhere in the depths of the ocean, German engineers, still unaware of this, were building new U-boats. Soon they would set out to sea, and a new battle would begin. A battle of sound against silence. September 1939. Europe is once again engulfed in the flames of war. Britain declares mobilization, and at sea begins what everyone feared, the Battle of the Atlantic. German submarines, the U-boats, leave their bases in Kiel and Brest, hunting merchant ships carrying food, oil, and weapons to Britain. The first weeks of war feel like a nightmare resurrected from the past. Convoys vanish, ships burn, and radio transmissions are filled with desperation. Torpedoed, sinking, requesting assistance. At the Admiralty, the atmosphere borders on panic. The invisible enemy once again rules the sea. But now Britain has Aztec. Not a gun, not a mine, not a torpedo, but hearing that listens in the dark. Advanced devices are installed on destroyers. Sailors undergo accelerated training, learning to listen, to distinguish, to respond. Headphones become their eyes. Each ping is like a breath, a short, metallic sound sent into the depths and returned as an echo. In the headphones, silence no longer frightens. It means the enemy isn't there. What frightens now is the echo. A short knock, like the muffled heartbeat of something underwater. When it appears, everyone freezes. The operator straightens, his face pale. Contact, bearing 210, distance 800 yards. Now the hunt begins. The destroyer changes course. Hydrophones rotate. The signal grows louder. The operator speaks in a whisper, as if afraid to scare the sound away. He's diving deeper. On deck, depth charges are prepared. Heavy cylinders filled with explosives. A minute later, they drop into the water, and the ship shudders from the blasts. If the echo disappears, the target is hit. If it remains somewhere below, the enemy still lives. German submariners quickly realize they're facing a new weapon. In reports, U-boat commanders write, "We hear strange signals, short clicks repeating at regular intervals. Then, depth charges. They found us, even though we were silent." That sound, the Aztec ping, becomes for submariners what the wail of sirens is for Londoners, a symbol of fear. It means one thing: the hunt has begun. But for the British, the war of sound is no easy journey. Aztec helps locate submarines, but doesn't always destroy them. Sometimes the subs dive too deep, breaking contact. Sometimes signals get confused in the waves, bounce off the seabed. And sometimes Aztec gives false readings, wasting ammunition. The sea does not tolerate certainty. It always leaves room for doubt. Nevertheless, it is thanks to Aztec that Britain withstands the early years of the blockade. When German wolf packs attack convoys, escort ships hear them approaching in advance. Now, submarines cannot strike with impunity. Every attack becomes a risk. Invisibility, the submariner's greatest advantage, has been broken. Boyle and his team gather again in London. Instead of lab coats, they now wear military uniforms. They are not on the front lines, but their work is a weapon. Every new report from the sea is a lesson. Engineers refine the equipment, increase sensitivity, develop new algorithms to filter noise. Aztec is no longer just a device. It is a living system, evolving with the war. With each passing month, the British grow more skilled in their invisible art of listening. Specialists emerge who, from a single echo, can tell whether a submarine is approaching or retreating. More and more often, it is ASDIC that determines the outcome of a naval battle. Not speed, not firepower, but the ability to hear. The Germans begin searching for ways to hide. They shut down engines, lie on the seabed, pretend to be rocks, but sound cannot be fooled. ASDIC hears even the faint echo of a hull, even the tremble of a propeller barely touching the water. The sea is no longer their ally. Now it speaks to those who know how to listen. At the Admiralty, they quietly joke, if Neptune were on our side, he'd have ASDIC. But inside, everyone knows the worst is yet to come. A war of endurance. Submarines will evolve, and so will sound. And victory will not belong to the loudest, but to the one who hears silence most precisely. In one of Scotland's quiet coves, where waves crash against the rocks and the air smells of salt and fuel oil, lies a base unmarked on any map. Behind a tall fence in wooden barracks, the same sounds echo day and night. Whispers, pulses, rhythmic pings. This is the ASDIC training station, a place where a new kind of soldier is forged, one who can hear underwater. Inside the classrooms stand rows of strange devices, round screens, headphones, microphones, control panels with spinning dials. The instructors, former engineers and sailors, teach recruits the basics of acoustic warfare. The sea is alive, says one of them. It breathes, it whispers, it lies. Your job is to tell truth from deception. Each cadet is given a pair of headphones. At first, all they hear is noise, endless murmuring, like wind on a radio. But gradually, distinct sounds begin to emerge from the chaos. A propeller, the thump of a turbine, the echo of the seabed. Listen deeper, the instructor repeats. Not with your ears, but with your attention. Among the cadets, there's a running joke. We're Neptune's musicians. Our score is the ocean, and the enemy is the false note. But behind the humor lies tension. There's no room for error. One wrong identification, and a convoy could be lost. During training, instructors often stage false alarms, playing sounds that resemble submarines and watching who panics. Only the most composed remain calm. Special emphasis is placed on silence. Paradoxically, silence is the operator's most powerful tool. If you know what peace sounds like, you immediately notice when it's disturbed. Silence is like a blank page, says Chief Petty Officer Fletcher, a veteran of the First World War. The enemy leaves a mark on it. You just have to see it with your ears. After several weeks, the cadets take their final exam. They're given real recordings made at sea. On the tape, dozens of minutes of chaos, bubbling, whistling, crashing waves, the tapping of a propeller. From this sea of sound, they must extract the one thing that matters, the echo of a submarine. Almost no one succeeds on the first try, but those who do become the ears of the fleet. At the graduation ceremony, they receive no medals, only an emblem, a silver letter A with a wave. To outsiders, they're just radio operators. But the sailors know. These are ASDIC operators, the ones who hear the enemy before anyone sees it. When they return to their ships, the atmosphere in the fleet begins to change. Now, combat logs increasingly include the entry: contact detected by ASDIC, enemy neutralized. And though it's just a few words, behind them lie hundreds of lives saved. With each passing month, the ASDIC school grows. Branches appear across Britain, from Liverpool to Portsmouth. Instructors no longer just teach. They develop methodology, turning intuition into science. they introduce signal standards, a noise classification system, the first catalogues of underwater sounds. Thus, a new profession is born, the hydroacoustician. These are the people who will become the key to underwater warfare in the 20th century. Sometimes, in rare moments of rest, operators walk to the shore. They sit by the sea, listening to the splash of waves, and they can't help but analyze where the break is, where the tide shifts, where the hum of a fishing boat's motor begins. The sea has become a text they read without words. They know. Every sound matters. And if you listen closely enough, even the ocean whispers the truth. Underwater warfare had become a game of hide-and-seek, with thousands of lives at stake. Asdic gave the British an advantage, but not for long. The Germans quickly realized that the key to survival was silence. Now, both sides were no longer competing in speed or armor, but in invisibility. By 1941, the Kriegsmarine High Command gave its engineers a clear directive: find a way to make British instruments go silent. And they devised a clever trick, the Pillenwerfer, or noise pill. A small cylinder ejected by a submarine into the water. Inside was a chemical compound that released gas bubbles, creating a false acoustic trail. Asdic would mistake the noise for a real target and lose track of the actual submarine. In early trials, the system worked perfectly. Destroyers dropped depth charges in the wrong direction, while the U-boat quietly slipped into the depths. The Germans rejoiced. The British were confused, but not for long. At Bletchley Park, where mathematicians were breaking Enigma codes, a parallel team of naval engineers was at work. They studied the acoustic signals of the Pillenwerfer and noticed something. The false target sounded too perfect. A real submarine was never that clean. The sound of a human-made machine always carried a hint of chaos. Thus, a new version of Asdic was born, one that could distinguish between live and dead echoes. The device now analyzed not just direction, but the character of the sound, its rhythm, density, and vibration. This feature would become the ancestor of modern acoustic signatures, by which every ship in the world can now be identified. But the Germans didn't give up. They improved their submarines, adding special rubber coatings that absorbed sound. They called them Alberic, after the dwarf from German mythology who could turn invisible. These submarines were nearly impossible to hear. "They're like ghosts," wrote one British commander in a report. "We know they're near, but Asdic is silent." In response, the British developed a new type of sonar, the Type 144. It could rotate with the ship, maintaining contact even during maneuvers. Now the hunt became a true art. The Asdic operator guided the submarine like a conductor leading an orchestra, adjusting angle, frequency, and signal strength, sometimes for hours on end. Beneath the surface, this confrontation became a duel of hearing. Whoever lost focus first lost the battle. Sometimes victory came not from technology, but from sheer human endurance. One famous case, the destroyer HMS Hesperus maintained contact with a U-boat for 7 straight hours. The signal faded and returned, but the operator never let go. When the submarine finally surfaced, exhausted, the British captain wrote in his log, "We won not with depth charges, but with patience." Meanwhile, scientists continued to improve the equipment. In the laboratories of Portsmouth and Fareham, new microphones were developed, capable of distinguishing even the vortex of a propeller blade. Each new prototype was tested in massive tanks, acoustic domes, where engineers simulated seabeds and wave patterns. These were no longer just devices. This was a true science of sound at sea, born in the midst of war. By 1943, the confrontation had reached its peak. U-boats now hunted in coordinated groups, wolf packs. But convoys were now escorted by dozens of ships equipped with ASDIC, and overhead flew aircraft with radar. Those who had once been hunters were now the hunted. German fleet commander Karl Dönitz once admitted, "They see us when we are blind. They hear us when we are silent." And in those words lay the essence of the entire race beneath the waves. Technologies born in laboratories had proven just as decisive as armies on land. By then, ASDIC had evolved into a vast network of hearing that spanned the Atlantic. Every ship became part of a single ear, listening to the sea. And though the Battle of the Atlantic would continue until the very end of the war, it was this listening, this ability to hear, that saved Britain from starvation and the Allies from defeat. Spring 1945. The sea still hums, but now, within its noise, there is no fear, only relief. German submarines surrender one after another to the Allies. The fleet that once held the Atlantic in terror is now silent, like a tired beast that has lost its teeth. On the decks of British ships, sailors allow themselves to smile for the first time in years. Not because the war is over, not yet, but because now they hear silence. After years when every splash might have been the echo of a torpedo, silence has become the most precious sound. At ASDIC bases, old devices are being dismantled. They are replaced by new, improved models, lighter, more precise, more resistant to noise. Sailors who have weathered the storms of the Atlantic are reluctant to part with them. "This ping saved my life," says one operator, gently touching the old casing of the locator. To them, ASDIC is not just equipment. It is a companion that stood beside them when darkness raged all around. It heard when humans could not see. It became humanity's second set of ears beneath the water. After the war, Britain begins to declassify parts of its archives. And the world learns for the first time how vital the role of these anonymous listeners of the sea truly was. Newspapers publish articles with headlines like, "The Secret to Victory in the Atlantic, Hearing Instead of Sight." Scientists, engineers, and officers who had long hidden their work under the label "top secret" finally step into the light. They are no longer just military personnel. Now they are pioneers of a new science, one that will be called hydroacoustics. ASDIC, this strange metallic ear of the sea, gives rise to countless peaceful discoveries. Soon, systems emerge for detecting icebergs, navigating ships, and even studying whales. Sound, which once hunted death, now helps us understand the ocean. In 1947, the British share the technology with their allies. The Americans develop it under a new name, sonar. What began as a weapon against submarines becomes one of the most important tools in oceanography. The irony of fate, a military race born of fear, gives the world a way to listen to the planet. Thanks to ASDIC, humanity hears the depth of the ocean for the first time, a realm that had previously only been guessed at. Scientists discover underwater mountains, trenches, and unknown currents. The world that once hid beneath the waves now speaks to us. In the 1950s, a museum in Portsmouth installs an old ASDIC Type 128 device. It stands in a corner, quietly blinking its lights and occasionally emitting a faint ping. On the plaque it reads, "The one who listened to the darkness." School children, sailors, and veterans pass by. Some smile, Others stand silently for a long time. Because for some, it's just a piece of equipment. But for others, it's a symbol of hope. Proof that even in the darkest times, victory is possible if you learn to hear where others remain silent. Today, decades later, the principles of ASDIC live on in underwater systems around the world, from scientific stations to 21st century submarines. And every time an operator switches on the locator and hears that familiar metallic ping somewhere deep in history, a memory responds, an echo from the time when sound became salvation, and the sea, a battlefield where victory belonged to those who could hear through the silence. After the war, many of those who had worked with ASDIC returned to civilian life. They no longer sat in stuffy cabins, listening for echo pings through headphones. But the sounds of the sea stayed with them forever. Many became engineers, oceanographers, teachers, people who continued to listen to the ocean, not for survival, but for understanding. Former Officer Thomas Boyd opened a laboratory on the coast of Cornwall. On the wall hung a map of the Atlantic, and beside it, an old ASDIC headset. When students asked why he kept it, he smiled. Because that sound taught me to hear not just the enemy, but life itself. Scientific expeditions in the 1950s began using sonars built on ASDIC principles. They measured depths, mapped the ocean floor, and discovered the Mariana Trench. Each ping reflected from the abyss was a step into a new era of knowledge. What once saved ships now helped humanity rediscover the planet. In the British Museum of Science in London stands a metal cylinder labeled ASDIC Type 128. Tourists, children, and veterans pass by. They press a button, and a short, crystalline sound plays through the speakers. Ping. Simple, almost musical, and everyone falls silent. Because that sound is not just a signal. It is the echo of those who listened to the darkness so that others could see the dawn. Scientists call ASDIC the first step into the era of acoustic perception of the ocean. Engineers call it a bridge between war and science. And sailors simply say, "It saved us." Many years have passed since then. Sonars have become digital. Nuclear submarines dive to depths of kilometers, and satellites draw acoustic maps of the ocean. But the principle remains the same. Listen to the silence, and it will tell you the truth. ASDIC was not just an invention. It became proof that humanity can triumph not through shouting, not through explosions, but through the ability to hear. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the Second World War. Sometimes, to survive, you don't need to shoot louder. You need to listen deeper. The war has long faded, but sound still remembers. With each passing decade, the children of ASDIC, engineers, physicists, acousticians, continue to seek answers in the whispers of the ocean. Now, beneath the waves, they listen not for enemies, but for the life of the planet itself. The 1950s, scientists from Britain and the United States create SOSUS, a vast network of underwater microphones stretched across the Atlantic. It can detect the faint rustle of a submarine off the coast of Greenland, or the rumble of a volcano on the floor of the Caribbean Sea. For the first time, the world realizes the ocean is not silent. It is alive, and within it resounds a symphony of invisible creatures, currents, earthquakes, and whale songs. Ironically, a technology born of fear becomes a tool for understanding the world. Hydroacoustics gives rise to a new science, the oceanography of sound. Now, sound is not just a means of defense, but a language through which Earth speaks. In the 1960s, oceanographers send the first research bathyscaphe, Trieste, into the Mariana Trench. On board is an advanced sonar, a direct descendant of Aztec. When the instrument detects the seabed at a depth of 10,911 meters, one of the operators whispers, "We are hearing what no one has ever heard before." The world holds its breath. For the first time, humanity not only sees the depths, but hears how the abyss sounds. Meanwhile, former Aztec operators find themselves again in a new era. Some work in marine laboratories, some design civilian echo sounders for fishermen. Others record ocean sounds for documentaries. They laugh. Now we're catching tuna, not enemies. But in those words is tenderness. They remember how it all began, how once amid the thunder of war, they first heard a faint echo, like the pulse of the ocean. Today, underwater sound has become commonplace. It is used by ecologists, navigators, archaeologists. But few know that all these technologies, from fish finders to ultrasound scanners, trace their lineage to that very first ping that echoed in the cold waters of the North Sea nearly a century ago. Sometimes in naval archives, one can find recordings from old operators. On them, muffled clicking sounds, rustles, metallic echoes. At first glance, just noise. But if you listen closely, you can hear something else. In every ping, there is a heartbeat. The heartbeat of people who, in the darkness of the sea, found a way to make light from sound. Aztec became something greater than an invention. It turned into a bridge between war and knowledge, between humanity and nature. And somewhere on the ocean floor, that bridge still resonates. Quietly, rhythmically, steadily.